Good morning and welcome to the new episode of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. Canada is deemed to be a country where there are not many disputes, while the political shenanigans in the other countries are really tragic. Here, politics as yet has not degenerated to that level where it has. For example, in our neighbor South in USA, where dirty politics has crossed all decent human limits. Like in South Asia, where politics has degenerated into personal animosity and enmity. And that's why governance in Canada is not very difficult. But it's not thanks to the system. The system is really outdated and needs to be changed. It's flawed. And although the people are docile, law abiding by and large, they do not try to create unnecessary hurdles in the way of the government. But the question arises, is the Canadian system capable of coping with the challenges and the threats posed by the 21st century? And the reply to this simple question is absolutely no. The pandemic and the climate change are, for example, changes, two challenges that the fathers of Canadian Constitution could never have visualized. The Constitution sets out the division of powers between Ottawa and the provincial governments. But although the powers are clearly defined, the way they are defined is really not acceptable. It is, in fact, divisive because the politicians try and struggle with large scale threats such as climate change, state of the long term care, COVID-19 pandemic, and then the situation in the country is such that the provincial and the regional aspirations take precedence over the national targets, goals, and policies. And that's a real problem. Both levels of the government, federal and the provincial, have failed, for example, to take the lead on the climate change. And that, as I said very correct recently, in 1867, when the Constitution was first drafted, nobody could have thought that the climate change would be a major issue. And you can see the muddled nature of Canada's approach to climate change in its patchwork of environmental policy. And the recent unsuccessful legal challenge of the federal carbon tax by the government of Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. That failed, of course. But a simmering feeling and emotion was created that the West needs to separate from Canada and become an independent country. And the part of the blame is on the Canadian Constitution, the way the system has evolved. You know, the Canadian Constitution is built like a machine that has 11 steering wheels. And now, suppose you're going in a car and there are diverse, many, 11 in this case, steering wheels. Each person tries to move the steering wheel in its own way. So it's a deadlock. And everybody, if they all want to go to the same direction, all want to have the same route, the same GPS guides them, that's fine. That's great. But if they don't want to go in the same direction, then the whole thing grinds to a halt. And that's what's happening here in Canada. For the last 25 years, I've been here for 20 years, but I've been watching for the country for a long time since my son came here. The most carbon intensive provincial governments do not want to go in the same direction. And rightly so, because the economy, the wealth of the provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, is dependent on oil. And they resisted the action on the climate change. Not very wrong. You cannot accept somebody to commit harakiri for not very clear idea, because climate change is natural, as I have been saying. Even if you stop all oil, it would take place. There have been 6 extinctions of life. I wrote in my article, which you can read otherwise, that 5 extinctions are already taken place in the world. Sixth is on the way. So there was no oil at that time. What happens is that the provinces resisted the change. The federal government, because of its commitment at Paris, wanted to meet the targets. But in face of provincial opposition, they backed off. So it was one step backward, 2 steps forward, then another 3 steps backward, 4 steps forward. That's what I'm saying. So first there was cooperation, then came the conflict. And the worst aspect of the federal system, the government, came into light at the pandemic. In the early stages of the crisis, Prime Minister Trudeau held regular conference calls with the premiers to discuss shared priorities. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc said the provincial and the federal government were working as a group when responding to the outbreaks, especially in the long-term care centers. That was great. And that was meeting the ends. At the request of both Quebec and Ontario, Ottawa even sent the armed forces to help the health professionals at various long-term care facilities. So everything was going gaga. There was no problem. And then these successes worked together because the national government was able to provide assistance to the province's particular need. But then the priorities changed. The federal system became a barrier to an effective, robust response. And while all the governments need to double down to work collectively for the good of the people, the federal government and the provincial government might have tried. I'm not doubting their bona fides, but they were not perfect. There was a partisan push, and the conversation and the focus of the Canadians shifted. The spirit of collaboration, which was there in the beginning of COVID, did not last and gave way to the confrontation. As a matter of fact, this is an emergency federalism. By emergency federalism, I mean a federalism that can face the emergencies, and either the federal government takes recourse to the harsh measures, war measures they call it, to supersede the provinces, or they sit together and evolve a policy that's the best interest of the country. The early part of the pandemic was the period of emergency federalism, and the Trudeau government was taking a leadership role. And everybody seemed to be in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. Then the conflict started emerging. The first was Premier Duckford. He complained that the Trudeau government did not move quickly enough to close the borders or provide vaccine. Justified from his point of view. And this was an error of the Trudeau government, undeniably. They should have closed the border. Even now, they have not closed the border properly. Then came the problem. Some provinces are more eager than others to open up, like Alberta. It should not have opened up the way it has opened up, despite all my regard for Jason. He's a personal friend. I do not subscribe to the view that they should have opened it, especially when The Delta 4 variant is making a comeback, and there's a clear indication, hopefully it doesn't happen, that there might be a revival of the scourge of coronavirus. So if Alberta's example is followed all over, you will see the tension reviving. And then the rollout of vaccines. That's when the real blame game started in. It kicked in. The provinces were saying we can vaccinate more people if the government would get the act together in procurement. And the government was stupid enough, federal government, let's be very clear. They signed an agreement with China for Sino vaccine. The Chinese backed out, and there's a clause in the agreement that the government can claim damages. And the government said, no, we don't want to claim the damages. We don't want to annoy China. That is the subject of my other comment one day. I'll take it up maybe next week. But the government has been stupid enough. They first said, we don't want AstraZeneca, and then they said, okay, we're going for AstraZeneca. The whole thing was topsy-turvy. And the health chief medical officer, Dr. Tang, did not crown herself in glory. But one thing is definite, that the federal government failed to get that together. And the feds retaliated by pushing back the released data, showing that Ottawa was sending vaccines to different provinces, but they were just sitting in the freezers. Now, here comes the level of the blame, the Constitution. How? Healthcare is a responsibility that is shared at two levels of the government. Federal government transfers billions of dollars to the provinces. And the provinces are supposed to provide similar level of service across the country, but it's not similar. I've lived in Ontario for 20 years, and now I'm here in Alberta for 2 years, almost 1.5 years. And I can tell you that the sort of medical services there are in Ontario are 100 times better than there in Alberta, and people tell me Albertan situation is much better than in British Columbia. So there's no balance of the services. The pandemic has exposed the problems of the original framers of the Constitution. I agree, they didn't have the foresight, but they should have. And then the Constitution amendment is not that easy. We think that the Constitution is something sacrosanct. It's like Bible. Nobody can change it. It's like Quran, holy word. No, it's not. It is a document that should be changed as when needed. We have got to remember that Canada became a federal province state, a formal state at a time when healthcare, such as it really was, a local and a private matter. Today it's a national matter. It's not a local matter. So it was very reasonable to subject it to provincial jurisdiction. But there have been incredible technological advances in diagnostics and treatment. And the way in which we do the healthcare has changed beyond what anybody in the 19th century could have visualized. But the people who are imaginative, like in England, they have the best healthcare in the world. Sweden, Norway, Finland, they changed immediately. As soon as the situation changed, they said, no, we'll change it. So now we have the modern pandemic management, which is both national and public, neither local nor private. And so it doesn't fit in with the original design. And then when the original design doesn't fit, what do? Either you throw away the original design or you change it, alter it. And changing the constitution in this country is extremely difficult. I've taken only two issues, climate change and health. But if I take the other issues, education, infrastructure development, look at the way infrastructure is there in, for example, in Ontario. It's horrible. 401, 403, even 407. Then of 27 and others, the lesser said the better it is. and that traffic blockages held up are terrible. So the change, what we need is a change in the constitution. But here, as I said, changing the constitution is extremely difficult. The Prime Minister and the government have been very reluctant to invoke the Emergency Act. There's a loophole in the Constitution. They can invoke the Emergency Act to deal with the national crisis. And since Prime Minister has to fight an election, he doesn't want to annoy 4 out of 10 provinces by invoking the Emergency Act because there are political risks involved. If the federal government had come out with the Emergency Act and dictated a national approach to pandemic response or on future of long-term care, they would have been accountable. And they want to have a very safe walk, not go into any dicey situation. I'm not sure that the federal government would be willing to do that. They will rather have partners in the provinces they can pass blame to. So they want these provinces to suffer. So then they can blame the provinces and the premiers, especially if they belong to the opposition, like Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Because then they say, okay, we are doing it, but they are not doing it, they are not implementing it. Then there's a risk inherent in failing to learn from the lessons of the pandemic, the unprecedented heat wave that has afflicted Canada. 482 people died in one city in British Columbia, 25 wildlife. The whole city had to be evacuated. Here in Alberta, we had temperature going up to 45 degrees Celsius. I'm not blaming the government for that, but it's up to the political leaders to see whether we don't need a change in the constitution. The system has got to be changed. It's a flawed system. Why cannot we again have a sort of a constituent assembly that frames either a new constitution or modifies the constitution de novo? A more flexible, what we need is a more flexible form of federalism. Either that or the way India has done, a federation which is quasi-federation, federal, but primarily unitary. The Indian Prime Minister does not have to invoke Emergencies Act. The worst he can do is declare that the state government has failed to discharge its duties and hence is no longer functioning and the state becomes under the control of the federal government. And they can do it very easily. They don't have to declare emergency. So some methodology has to be developed. Some way has to be evolved that the system which is flawed, which is defective, is remedied. Because without that, there are going to be worse situations. Let's be very clear. The threats are going to be worse. Next is cybercrime, online terror activities, insults. How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to deal with that as a law and order issue? Are you going to deal with that as an aggression against the country? The constitution is mum on those issues. The defense of the country. The government closed down the Churchill port, the only port in the Arctic. The most idiotic thing to do, of course, as I had discussed at that time. So what we need is a new look at the constitution. What we need is either to have a new constitution, throw the old in the dustbin. There's nothing wrong with that. If we say declutter your house, if we say declutter your mind, if we say, then why not say declutter the system of the governance? That's the constitution. Rewrite the constitution if you can't amend it, or amend it to ensure that it can face the challenges that the country is going to face in this century and the next century. And if we can't do that, I can assure you Canadians are in for trouble. And that's why the enlightened leadership would act without any further delay. But is the leadership enlightened? I leave it to you to judge. Thank you.